Phil English, Tom Petri, Earl Pomeroy, and Senator Conrad, and we're hopeful that Senator Sessions will join as a co-chair as well. We're also very pleased today, it's not an accident, that we're doing today's event during America Saves Week, which is coordinated by America Saves as well as the American Savings Exchange Council. And they have a great new website, if you haven't seen it yet, americasavesweek.org. So I guess when we were thinking about this event, well, let me put it this way. A lot of people in this room who've cared about savings for a long time have wondered, what's it going to take to get Americans saving again? Well, it turns out that a debt-led recession, a mortgage meltdown that we haven't seen since the Great Depression, and 1 in 7 Americans dealing with a debt collector, maybe that's going to do the trick. So, I think Americans will start saving again, not because they want to, but because they have to. And I think what's a good barometer of that is the fact that Congress is showering the American people with money to go shopping. And it turns out, according to a recent survey, that only about 1 in 5 of them actually plan to do that, actually plan to go shopping. But the rest of them using the money for paying down their debts and for saving, which is very encouraging. So what we're going to talk about today is savings for what are some of the best ideas. We've got a superb panel here today to talk about the latest in best thinking in the field. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Congressman Jim Cooper, who, as I mentioned, is a co-chair of the Savings and Ownership Caucus, a superb leader of that. He serves on the Armed Services, Budget, and Government Reform Committees, and highly respected by Democrats and Republicans alike. And I often think of him, as does David Brooks of the New York Times, as the most prescient members of Congress. Jim Cooper usually gets it right, so I encourage you to pay attention to him. Thank you.
Did my mother write that introduction?
She taught this morning, yes.
I'll be brief. That's not a threat. This is a really important topic we're focusing on. And America Saves Week can literally help strengthen our nation, because our national security is important, our financial security is important. I hope you'll pay close attention to these panelists, because the growing consensus is building. Don't take my word for it. Martin Feldstein had a column in the Wall Street Journal last week basically pointing out that we've relied on the honor system to allow Wall Street to self-regulate. We tried that before the Depression. It didn't work very well. We put it in the SEC. Now, so many of these financial instruments are so complex. For example, take a single derivative product, credit default swaps. Nobody's ever heard of one. Credit default swaps. That one market is $45 trillion in size, which is 3 times the GDP of America. How many folks on our committees are literate in products like that? Of course, we're not just talking at the macro level, international finance, we're talking at the personal level. There's something simple like an automatic 401k plan, which fortunately, as the Savings and Ownership Caucus reform has already passed. It's being implemented right now, can literally change the destiny of a nation. So it could be a more important topic, and I'm delighted first to welcome Javier Becerra, who's an amazing member of Congress. He first came in 1992. He's on the Ways and Means Committee, which is the envy of every legislator on the planet. He's the only one from Southern California on that exalted committee, which makes him even more popular than he would have been otherwise. But he and I share an enthusiasm for Barack Obama. So when Barack's in the White House, you're going to be even more powerful. But in the meantime, he's just assistant to Speaker Pelosi. He does a great job advising her on a lot of key issues. But I'm particularly proud of the fact that he's on the Health Oversight and Social Security subcommittees. You don't get more powerful than that. Plus, he's on the Budget Committee. Plus, he's a nice guy, and he's the son of working class folks. He's the first person in his family to graduate from college. Now he's married to Dr. Carolina Reyes, And they're the proud parents of 3 young daughters, Clarissa, Olivia, and Natalia. Javier Casero.
Jim, thank you for rolling your R's. As Jim mentioned, I'm from the suburb of Tennessee called Los Angeles, and proud to hail from it. I'm very pleased to join with Congressman Cooper in raising what I think is a very important issue, and pleased to join Ray and all the folks at the New American Foundation, and certainly, of course, your talented panelists to talk about an issue which I think is very important. You wouldn't know it from the looks of things, but on a daily basis, I guess all of us are still getting mail from all the credit card companies to continue to fill out new credit applications. My daughter's, the oldest, who is 14, also received credit card applications. So you wouldn't know there's a problem in savings by the way things are run these days, that we continue to receive mail and offers to go ahead and get further into debt. But let me challenge both your panelists and those who are here observing a little bit. Let me turn things a little bit upside down. I'm going to tell you that most modest income families are great savers. Unfortunately, they don't get to save the money that they would otherwise love to save. And I'll just run down some quick ideas of why I say they're actually great savers already. And we could make them phenomenal investors if we just had an opportunity to. How much does the average person with modest income and say isn't banked, doesn't have a banking account, checking account, or a credit card, pay to be able to cash his or her paycheck on a monthly or weekly or bi-weekly basis? Well, for most folks, it totals around $1,000 in a year that they pay in these fees to payday lenders. If you were to add up with that what too many Americans, millions of Americans, pay to what are called these lending advancers, the payday, the refund anticipation loans that go out to folks who are filing their income tax return and know they're going to get a credit. Maybe it's the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit. But many Americans, millions in fact, make use of refund anticipation loans where they in essence get their money up front. They think for a pretty good deal. At the end of the day, though, they're paying very, very high fees. And at the end of the day, they end up paying somewhere around $132, $135 in fees just for an advance of about 3 weeks. When you add on top of that the tax preparation fees they probably pay to the tax preparer to be able to file their income tax return, any check cashing fees that would go along with being able to cash those checks since they don't have checking accounts, it totals something over $300 in a year that someone might pay to get a refund anticipation loan and then to pay for all the other fees that might be associated with it. On top of that, many hardworking Americans are like my parents, immigrants. And I'll give you just a very quick example. My parents they hail from Mexico. And today we have millions of immigrants that came from Mexico who are today continuing their ties to Mexico. They are here, been here for years, but they continue to help folks back home. Something to the tune of about $23 billion last year. For the average family, that totals something around $3,500 in the year that's sent back home. You could talk to the Salvadoran immigrant, you could talk to the Malaysian immigrant, you could talk to the Indian immigrant, and it's the same thing. Total all that up, you're looking at about $4,700 in 1 year that many of these very modest income earning families has banked away in various ways, but not in a bank. Now, if we were to just take the the payday lender fees, because that's what most modest income families use annually, and in some cases weekly. If you just take the fees, $1,000 annually, the average, and instead of having to put that into fees that do nothing for that family, consider those $1,000 banked. After an average 40-year career, that individual would have about $360,000 in a retirement account, just with the payday lending fees that could have been saved. And so it shouldn't be strange to you that some families actually at a modest income earning category can do fairly well. My parents, my wife and I make in 1 year what it took my parents 15 years to make. Yet today my parents make more in retirement than they ever made when they were working. They happen to be one of the lucky families that found a way to save a little bit. They finally bought a home, and from there they were able to buy another home, and another small one. But before they knew it, they weren't just owners, they were also landlords. And today they are better off than they ever were when they worked. They are one of the fortunate few who was able to buy at that point in time. Today it's almost impossible, obviously, with the prices of homes. But I say this to you, as we talk about families that are modest income and how they're not savers, let's remember they're savers, they're great savers. They just can't put the money where you and I put it, into some type of retirement account. We have to figure out a way to stop them from paying exorbitant fees here, unreasonable charges there, and get shafted over there. And if we could do that, you would find that, like my parents, they will be very ready for retirement. So our challenge is not just to figure out how they can save, how to teach them to save. Quite honestly, they could do a little bit to teach some of us how to save. What we have to do is figure out how we get them out of this burdensome problem of trying to get their money, the costly effort to get their money that they so deservedly earn, and now be able to keep some of it for themselves for their retirement. And so that's a challenge I set for our panelists and for you to discuss, is how we get to the point where we help people like Maria Teresa and Manuel Becerra, who somehow found a way to save a little bit here and a little bit there. Before they knew it, they had a great nest egg. And do the same thing for all those other Maria Teresa and Manuel Becerras in this world who are trying to do the same thing, as they also help family back home in the mother country. They're actually great savers. They're great Americans. And we'll find that they will be great investors in our, not only our kids and our future, but in their retirement, if we just give them an opportunity to get from under the burden they have of constant fees that only they, the modest income, pay. And so I hope you are able to come up with some answers that Congressman Cooper and I are able to use as one of the leaders in the Budget Committee. Congressman Cooper certainly will be able to take this a lot farther than I will. He was gracious in his remarks to me, but that's what you always do when you're ahead of someone in seniority. So it's easy to say that. But I hope that what you'll do is recognize that more people than not are already great savers. And they wouldn't be getting those credit card applications if they weren't. And so I hope that what we'll do is figure out a way to help them really save, not just for today, not just for the family back in the mother country, but for tomorrow when they are retired. Thank you very much.
Maria Teresa, Manuel Becerra. Those are the watchwords. Next speaker has been a heroine of mine for a long time. She's an amazing lady. I think she's worked for some of the most interesting places that you could possibly work for. Chrysler, Mathematica, the Department of Labor, Brookings, Urban Institute. She was Outlook editor for the Washington Post, our hometown newspaper here. Washington Bureau Chief for Slate. Now she's senior editor at the Pew Research Center. Jody Ellen is an amazing lady. She can write and think. She's used both halves of her brain for a long, long time now. I wish that everyone could do the same. Thank you, Jody.
Callie and I don't even share a committee. That was very nice of you to do. I should warn everyone here that my topic today is not exactly cheerful. I have entitled my speech, Debtor's Prison. Can the United States find an escape room? Many of you may remember the debtors' prisons from Victorian-era novels like David Copperfield. Debtors' prison, of course, was a place where they locked up the likes of Wilkins Micawber when his income fell chronically short of his outgo. Now, in a Dickensian world, America and most of its consumers would have been locked up long ago. And while that might not have improved the revenue side of the nation's balance sheet, it would certainly have limited the expenditure side. Instead, as we now, as the congressman have pointed out, the economy is sagging under a burden of debt. And we face essentially a classic prisoner's dilemma. The very interventions that we're likely to undertake to keep the economy perking are also likely to increase the very indebtedness that lies at the heart of our problems. Now, our panelists today are going to offer some practical ideas of how we can alleviate, if not completely resolve, our predicament. And many of their suggestions will focus especially on those middle and lower income Americans who at present contribute a lot to the nation's consumptive drive, but relatively little to our net savings and investment. To get myself in the mood, and perhaps you too, for these remedies, I put together a list of some scary numbers. Although I have to admit that Congressman Cooper's number about the, what were they?
Credit default swaps.
Well, yes, beats all my numbers. But anyway, these are not the local numbers, these are American numbers. And let's start with a relatively small sum, but a negative one. Minus $811 billion. That was the U.S. current account deficit in 1 year, 2006. The value of the goods and services that we sold to other countries, plus our returns on investments that we made in the past overseas, minus the value of the stuff they sold us, and the increasing amount of interest and dividends we now owe the farmers. Now, to most of us, 800 billion may seem like a pretty big number, but it is small compared with some of the other numbers I found while I was looking around. I took a look at the Federal Reserve's accounting of debt outstanding by sector, and I found some really big numbers. Let's take 2.5 trillion, of course, that's thousands of billions. That's the amount that Americans owe on their credit cards and other forms of consumer debt, not including mortgages. In December, just a couple months ago, total household savings were essentially zero. That meant that all the net savings that presumably the upper income people made were more than offset or were equally offset by dissaving, which is to say borrowing elsewhere in the income distribution. That's pretty disturbing. We used to say, not all that many years ago, our savings rate was, I think in 90, about 15%. We're taking 2.2 trillion, that's the total sum of state and local borrowing. That sounds pretty big, but it's dwarfed by the $5 trillion, which is the publicly held treasury debt, the federal debt. And that's just the publicly held part of it. 2 trillion of it we've added in just the last 7 years. Also, keep in mind that the public debt would be about 2 trillion higher, more than 2 trillion higher, if it had not been possible for the Treasury to borrow all those surpluses that built up in the Social Security trust funds ever since 1992 reforms. 82 reforms, excuse me. Somehow we're always led to believe that Social Security is the problem. Well, it will get to be a problem, but if in fact Social Security had been able to keep and invest the surpluses that have been built up ever since they raised payroll taxes and cut benefits in '82, it would be in fact sitting. Instead, we took that money and we used it to pay for expenses elsewhere in the budget, and everybody seems to forget that. And then finally, there's the $3 trillion in net debt to foreigners that we have piled up in every year starting again in the early 80s. Now, when you add together all these public and private debts, as the Federal Reserve does, you come up with a number that of more than $30 trillion, almost as big as the credit swap debenture or whatever. 30 trillion is a big number, even for a $14 trillion economy. And it's kind of hard for me. I don't think that Mr. McCarver could even have imagined a number that big with so many zeros trailing after it. I think there are 13 zeros after the 3 and 30 trillion. Now, it's worth thinking about how, absent a lockup for national debtors, the United States managed to prosper, even as it sunk deeper and deeper into the red ink. Now, remember that according to those Economic 101 textbooks you may have studied, this should never have happened. The system was supposed to be just like financial systems are supposed to be self-regulating. Well, so economies are supposed to be self-correcting. When we began to run those chronic deficits way back in the 80s, there was a time not long before that when we were the world's biggest creditor. Now, of course, we are the world's biggest debtor. When we began to run those deficits, the textbook said that the value of the dollar should have fallen. That should have made Americans stop buying. That would have made foreign goods more expensive. We would have bought fewer of them. On the other hand, our goods would have been cheaper. They would have bought more of our goods, and the whole thing was supposed to be self-correcting. Now, I don't have to tell you that that didn't happen, nor did any general misery ensue. How was that so? Well, like, if I may cite another literary work, the reason is that like Blanche Dubois in the streetcar named Desire, we were able to depend on the kindness of strangers. And foreigners, most notably the governments of Asia, but also OPEC and elsewhere, have been willing to feed our addiction to overspending. They are our enablers. By buying up our financial and our tangible assets, they are effectively lending money to our government and to our consumers so that we will keep on buying their goods and strengthening their industrial bases. Meanwhile, as Congressman Cooper reminded us, close to home, our own financial innovators have been busy facilitating and indeed encouraging ever greater indebtedness among Americans. Now, the breakthrough here, of course, was the bundling of debts into marketable securities, not just mortgages, which we're hearing a lot about, the securitized mortgages, but all sorts of other obligations, including credit cards and every other kind of junk you can think of. Now, this innovation has had the marvelously enabling side effect of disassociating risk from the process of lenders. Why worry about your borrower? Why not just dole out the mortgage and the second mortgage and the extra credit cards and the auto loans and the student loans and whatever, when you can package up the resulting obligations, you take your slice in terms of a fee, and then you pass the trash. And there are plenty of trashies out there willing to take this stuff all over the globe. I don't know if many of you saw that wonderful, well, it wasn't wonderful, the Wall Street Journal article not long ago about the little town in the northern part of Norway that found its entire, what it thought were its surplus funds tied up in some securitized mortgage, bundled whatever, which turned out to be worth nothing. When it gets that close to the Arctic Circle, you know the stuff is real, trash is really spread. Now, in recent months, as the dubious nature of many of these supposedly securitized and lettered bundles, you know, the AAAs and the AAs and so on, as it's become apparent that, as some of them are pretty dubious in nature, we've seen the rise of a new set of big-time enablers of our consuming habits. They've been around, but they're suddenly making the covers of the magazines, and they are the so-called sovereign wealth funds. These are the state bank-backed investors from emerging economies. The Economist magazine estimates the current assets of these funds at close to $3 trillion, about 2/3 of which is oil and gas related. And the Economist cites a watcher of the funds that predicts that they will climb to $10 trillion by 2012 and perhaps double that in the next following years. Now, these sovereign wealth funds came to everybody's attention when they bailed out to the tune of $21 billion, both Citigroup and Merrill Lynch. In that case, it was mostly sovereign wealth funds from Singapore, Kuwait, and South Korea. Now, certainly this bailout was appreciated by both banks, caught as they were in the credit crunch. Still, as the Economist noted, and I quote, that has people worried for good reasons and bad. Well, let's set aside the bad reasons. the nationalistic or protectionist concerns about the ulterior motives of the sovereign wealth funds, real as these may or may not be. Let's focus instead on their staying power. Now, it's true that these countries acquire as they buy up our assets. They have an ever larger stake in the continuing health of our economy. But even if they're not likely to suddenly cash in their checks and head for the casino doors, all it would take to send U.S. financial markets into a precipitous downward spiral and U.S. inflation into a precipitously upward one would be for them to stop buying all the additional debt, just to stop buying new chips, even if they don't dump their old, that we keep piling up by the trillions. And on this, a credible source who asked to remain anonymous told me that they had been out talking to the managers of several of these sovereign wealth trust funds, who told them that their time horizon is not that long, that at the end of 12 months they intend to take a really harsh look at the things they brought up, and if they don't like the way they're performing, they're going to tote them. Now, as they say, they may think twice when the time comes, but all it takes is for them to stop buying at the margin for us to be in really bad trouble. Now, it took a while for the public and even longer for the policymakers to get seriously worried about our debtor's trap. Alan Greenspan has acknowledged in his recent book that he sort of thought that the housing bubblettes would just kind of peter out. But we found that a year ago, last spring, in the Pew Research Center surveys, that concern about the economy had mounted. Now, at that time, economists were still singing a happy song. The Fed wasn't worried, and most financial analysts were applauding how strong the economy continued to be. In Pew's latest, since then, of course, the experts have gotten a good deal more concerned, but the public has gotten yet more concerned. In our latest poll, February poll, we found that the public's fears have worsened sharply just since the start of the year. Only 17% of the public now rate the nation's economy as excellent or good. That's down from 26% in January. Now, 26% was already low, but to have it fall that much in a single month is striking. The number rating the economy as poor increased even more dramatically, from 28% to 45% in a single month. And whereas a year ago we saw a large partisan gap in views of the economy, a majority of Republicans were still, not a large majority, but a majority of Republicans were still calling the economy good. Now that gap is all but closed. The bad feelings are pretty universal. Incidentally, if you want to find more about this survey, which Ray cited earlier, you can tune your computer to pewresearch.org, where we put up links to all of our surveys and to the various parts of Pew, including this new religion survey you may have read about in the papers, which is very interesting. And to make matters more complicated for policymakers, more and more people are worried about inflation. Again, they got worried before the experts did. Nearly 6 in 10 among the public now say their incomes are falling behind the rising cost of living, and this is up from just 44% as recently as September. In fact, rising prices for gasoline or energy or healthcare or just overall inflation were mentioned most frequently by the public as the nation's biggest economic problem. And that was true well before you read these warnings about stagflation that all of a sudden you're seeing in last week's headlines. Global inflation is picking up too, as The Economist points out. Now, again, until very recently, the economists and the analysts were not worried about inflation. They kept issuing these soothing reminders that core inflation was relatively under control, so not to worry. But I thought at the time that many among the public probably subscribed to the view of one late-night comedian who remarked recently that he knew what core inflation was. It was the price of everything except the things you buy. Now, of course, people who have been out there buying food and gasoline have had quite a different view of things for quite a long time, too. People have been worried about inflation and our polls much more in the last few years than it did during the 90s. Well, at this point, things have gotten so bad that, as you know, the policymakers have even noticed. Unfortunately, the Federal Reserve, the instrumentality that we've come in recent decades to rely on, not only to control inflation, but to bail out irrationally exuberant investors, the Fed, unfortunately, is finding that its traditional remedies are severely constrained by the very debtor's dilemma that we're discussing. Fed Chairman Bernanke has given primacy to efforts to free up the flow of credit in capital markets. But the Fed's repeated cuts in short-term interest rates have had scant effect. Long-term rates have stayed stubbornly high, and credit is in very short supply. And that's because banks and businesses and even governments around the world are frozen in fear about what junk they may be holding, and they don't really know. They bought all these credit swaps, securitized whatevers, and no one really knows what the value is. Now, the problem there is that the fear is probably, bad as some of the stuff is, the fear is even more paralyzing, and it's going to take a while for this to unwind. And so, as a result, while the federal funds target rate has plummeted, that's the short-term rate the Fed's more or less control, corporate bond and other commercial rates have barely budged. And meanwhile, inflationary expectations have soared. Have you tried to buy some gold and platinum lately? So what we find is that the Fed is no longer even in semi-control of a world of money supply, which is awash in all these arcane monetary instruments. And it finds itself pushing on the proverbial string. Pushes down the interest rate, but nothing happens on the other end. Now, I don't have to tell this audience that in a rare moment of bipartisan haste, Congress and the White House recently put into law the $168 million economic stimulus package. And the main agent of revival is to be, this won't surprise you, a tax cut with the objective of stimulating, what else, more consumer buying. But since the federal budget is, even if it does stimulate buying, and Ray pointed out that our own poll shows all along when I see it that 17%, only 17% of people questioned say they're going to spend their tax cut. The rest of them all wisely say that they will save it or use it to pay off debt, which is the same thing. We will see. But nonetheless, no matter what they do, it's important to remember that since the budget, the federal budget, which will pay for this tax cut, is already deep in the red, the benefits will have to be financed by more borrowing from OPEC and the central banks of Asia. In other words, more of the very thing that caused the trouble to begin with, that financed consumption. Now, a solid, if so great case, it was made recently in Slate magazine by their very good financial analyst. He made the case that by failing to bite the bullet long ago, we deepened our entrapment, and that ameliorative efforts like the stimulus package will only prolong the pain of recovery. But it's important to remember that just as in Dickens' day, they weren't locking up the lords and ladies in debtor's prison. It was lower income people who bore the burden. And so too that is likely to be the case if we undertook very severe measures at the moment to deal with our troubles. And it's worth noting that the gap between the wealthiest and poorest people that they report in the difficulty in affording basic items is much wider now, to our surprise, than it was at the bottom of the '92 recession. And even that's the case, even though at the time of the '92 recession, many more people rated the economy poor, still there was a more even sharing of feelings of stress and strain than is the case now. And that really does put a constraint on the ability of policymakers to engineer an escape route from this prison in which we are now incarcerated. Well, what can we do about this? Well, the most likely thing we will do is to employ inflation, which of course devalues the debt. And over time, it may seem like the least painful solution. You look at it, I always think of it as default by degrees. You don't just walk away from the debt, you just make it worth less all the time. And we've been doing that lately as the dollar finally falls some. But remember, if we have too much inflation, it will prompt those sub-sovereign wealth fund managers to start dumping their dollar-denominated assets, and the resulting adjustment may not just be fast, but very agonizing. Of course, we could start paying off our federal debt by raising taxes on the people who are able to, oh, well, never mind, I don't even mention. Or we could try, and I couldn't resist it before I closed. Many of you may have noticed yesterday, Tom Tolles' 12-step debt addiction program. Tolles, of course, is the cartoonist on the editorial page of the Washington Post. It shows Uncle Sam at a blackboard writing down the initial steps to recovery. And he's writing, 1, admit the debt increases, increased my purchasing power. 2, recognize there is no greater consuming power than the United States. 3, make a list of all the people we owe and ask them for more money. 4, recognize defects in our account books and cleverly repackage them and sell them to the unwary. And the little man looking over his shoulder says, I'm not sure I'm feeling recovered yet. Well, no doubt our panelists have more hopeful and adaptive ways than these in which policymakers can address the root cause of our dilemma. And deep down, I somehow trust that we will muddle through. I am always reminded of one of my mother's favorite sayings, which was that God takes care of fools, drunks, and the United States of America. So let us hope he is not distracted by the concerns. Thank you very much.
I was just saying thank you, Jody, for giving us the macro perspective on what we're here to talk about today, bringing it down to the individual household level. Good morning, everybody. My name is Melissa Coity, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Financial Services and Education Project at the New America Foundation. Our work on the project focuses on policies related to consumer financial services, wealth-building financial services, as well as improving the effectiveness of financial education. You'll notice outside there are a number of materials about many of the different initiatives that the panel is going to discuss today. Please take a copy of that. You'll also find some material more about the Financial Services and Education Project. So I'm going to be presenting and moderating this panel, and I'd like to start off by actually introducing our presenters, who are going to discuss a number of policies to facilitate savings throughout the lifetime, from the need for short-term, immediate savings to withstand the unexpected expenses, as well as economic shocks, to midlife asset goals, to long-term retirement savings. Many of the proposals you're going to hear about this morning build on the learnings and insights from behavioral economics, showing that automatic features and some slight restrictions on access can have positive and significant effects on the savings activity and participation levels. You're going to first hear from Stephen Robeck. Steve is the Executive Director of the Consumer Federation of America, the largest consumer advocacy organization in the country. Steve frequently testifies before Congress, many of you I'm sure have seen him before, and he's authored numerous guides for consumers on banking and financial services. Today he's going to talk about his recent research showing consumers' needs for short-term savings. And in particular, he's going to talk about one product that's helping to meet those needs. I'm then going to talk about 4 policy initiatives to help facilitate the short-term savings needs, as well as to meet middle-term savings goals that can be done, we think, at scale and through the tax filing process. Carol Wayman will then present. She's the Legislative Director at CFED. I'm sure many of you are familiar with CFED, but if not, they're a national nonprofit that's focused through their research that poor and lower income households can and do save when provided with the right incentives, services, and support to do so. Carol leads CFPD's federal policy agenda and advocacy efforts, and today she's going to talk about policies to enable savings for middle-term savings goals, including home ownership and education. Our next panelist, who will be here in time to speak, is Mark Every. He will talk about savings policies to support longer-term savings and retirement objectives. Mark is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and the principal of the Retirement Security Project. He will be followed by Jack Trunicki, who is the Associate Vice President for Benefits Planning at Nationwide Insurance. Jack leads the benefits function for more than 37,000 nationwide associates and more than 6,000 retirees. And he's going to give us an inside industry perspective on automatic enrollment and automatic increases in retirement savings and the effect that that can have in terms of participation and savings levels. Following the presentation, we're going to have time for some questions and answers for the panel, and I really appreciate you all coming in this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Appreciate the opportunity to participate in this forum, and I'm especially grateful that you scheduled it during America Saves Week. Now, during this economic slowdown, which is probably a recession, we at the Consumer Federation of America are especially concerned about the tens of millions of Americans who cannot afford to increase their consumption. This includes the many, many households that are overburdened with high-cost debt, not just about $1 trillion in credit card debt, but also maybe $10 to $15 billion in payday loan debt and later high-cost debt. And in addition, we're concerned about that overlapping group of Americans that does not have adequate emergency savings to cover unexpected expenditures, ranging from a brake job when your car breaks down to a unexpected emergency dental visit. Now, who are those? This, of course, is a savings forum. My organization spent a lot of time on the debt-related issues as well, but today I'm going to talk about emergency savings needs. And let me start with a question: who really what families have emergency savings needs? Well, I've written a paper which I will send by email to any of you who leave me your card afterwards, that utilizes analysis of the Fed's 2004 Survey of Consumer Finances. That's the last large survey they conducted of household finances, and several surveys that we commissioned, analyzing all that data. And the conclusion resulting from that analysis is that a large majority of the 2/5 of all households with incomes under $35,000 have insufficient emergency funds to cover those unexpected expenses. Note that I'm not defining emergency savings needs and the needy as those with insufficient assets to cover the 2 to 6 months expenditures, which is the goal set by most financial advisors. Rather, we're defining emergency savings needs and those with these needs in a restricted fashion to include only those with inadequate financial assets to pay for normal unexpected expenditures, 2/3 of which, according to one of the surveys we commissioned, respondents told us relate either to transportation or to health care. Using this general criterion, most of both low and moderate income households, those in the lowest and the second lowest income quintiles, have unmet emergency savings needs. Let's start with the lowest income quintile. They tell the Fed researchers that they have typical emergency savings needs of $1,500, and they report in another survey they had typical spending in the last year of $2,000 of unexpected expenditures. So you have $1,500, $2,000 on one side. That's the need. Yet only 1/3 of these households have a savings account. Less than 3/10 say in another survey that they have emergency savings, however they define it, of at least $500. And the typical amount in all transaction accounts, according to the Fed data, and that's only of those that have them, a significant minority of low-income households do not have any transaction account, but for those that have them, the typical amount is only $600. So you can see here a huge, emergency savings gap for these households. Now, let's turn to the moderate income, that second income quintile. Their emergency savings needs are not as dire, but they are also very significant. These households report typical emergency savings needs of $3,000 and typical spending of $2,000 of last year's unexpected expenditures, so $3,000 and $2,000. Okay, that's the need. In terms of their capacity, less than half, slightly less than half, have a savings account. Less than half say they have emergency savings of at least $500, and the typical amount of those households that have transaction accounts, and the large majority do, the typical amount in all of these accounts is only $1,500. Again, you have a noteworthy emergency savings gap. So the question arises now, people say, well, these are just numbers. Are there real world consequences? These families that get in trouble, they go to their family, when they find ways, to manage. Are there real world consequences? Well, we looked at data, which is summarized on a sheet that has been passed down.
Yes.
Okay, there's a table there that summarizes most interesting findings of that analysis. It was really a survey with over 2,000 respondents. 450 of those respondents had incomes under $25,000. And we basically focused on this group. And we examined the relationship between available emergency savings and an array of negative financial experiences. We found, as you can see, that those with no emergency savings were about twice as likely as those with $100 to $500 in emergency savings to have difficulty making mortgage or rent payments, to bounce checks, to make minimum credit card payments, and to have payday loans. And these non-savers were 4 to 8 times more likely than those with at least $500 in emergency savings to have these negative financial experiences. Now, I was asked to keep my remarks pretty brief, so I don't really have much time to discuss solutions, but I would like to just outline some areas that maybe we can discuss later. And conclude by just saying a couple more words about America Saves Week. The solutions are not simple. They should emphasize automatic savings whenever possible, especially if you can build in the default option. A lot harder to do for emergency savings than for retirement savings. And they probably involve a combination. There's no single solution to this problem. A combination that includes employers through direct payroll deposits, making available and promoting easier emergency savings. I think that's the frontier when we look to employers to help their employees, say, build more adequate financial security in the short term, not just the long term, that which ought to increase work productivity. Second, banks and credit unions lowering their minimums and raising their yields on savings and promoting auto saves accounts much more aggressively. We're seeing a glimmer of that occurring, and I can talk more about that later. Although American savers are remarkably content with savings yields of under 1%. If they weren't so content, I think the yields would go up, because accounts are, if they're substantial, very profitable for the banks. Third, effective programs that persuade those receiving tax refunds and earned income tax credits, and that's in the tens of billions of dollars, to save just a portion of those refunds. That's the one windfall that most low-income households have, and we haven't figured out a way yet to persuade people to save a portion of that, because they've already spent it in their minds by the time they get their checks. But this is a very fruitful area to do research in and develop program in, and I know a number of folks are. Fourth, stored value cards with a savings bucket that's a default option with a financial institution that supports the saving. I'm not sure this is going to work if you don't have some kind of default option, some kind of strong encouragement for people to save a portion of a modest income and put it away in emergency savings. And it would really be helped if you had a financial institution that supported that. And then finally, more effective savings education, promotion, and marketing through efforts, and there are a number like America Saves Week. I mean, what we really have to do, in addition to changing institutions, is change the culture. You know, our society, frankly, pays lip service to savings, does not place a high enough value on it. How do we change the culture? Well, this is very difficult to do. On smoking, it took us 20 to 25 years. And even though we flipped the culture, the percentage of people who smoke only declined from like 44% to 22%. But we consider that a great victory. So we're not talking about, you know, going from 100% to 0% here. You know, you've all read about Malcolm Gladwell, and he's popularized the research on social marketing. You get to reach a tipping point. I actually do not think we're that far away from a tipping point in our society on savings. Most people are saving. A significant minority are saving adequately. But I think it's up to us. If we could mobilize all the major institutions in the country around us, I think we might get to a tipping point. Now, how do you do that? Well, there are many different strategies. One strategy that we think is promising is to try to persuade everybody, since they're not going to focus attention on this all year, to at least pay attention to it for 1 week during the year. That is more specifically to persuade tens of thousands of institutions ranging from employers to financial institutions, faith-based organizations, government leaders, the press, nonprofits, social service agencies, etc. during 1 week, to encourage all those people that they come in contact with, starting with their employees, but also the people they serve, to evaluate their financial condition and take remedial action, and to help them do that in all kinds of ways. Now, an employer can help them do that not just through sending out emails to all employees, which a number of employers have agreed to do during this America Saves Week, but also taking more aggressive steps to encourage them to take full advantage of their employer-based retirement programs, and to go beyond that, to consider creating other kinds of savings programs and incentives to participate in those programs. That's just for employers, and I could go right down the list, and if you wanted to ask me about a role for different kinds of organizations, I could talk about that, but I don't have enough time. Now, this year, we are just building a foundation, quite frankly. America Saves, which is managed by Consumer Federation of America, but includes 1,000 organizations nationwide, and we have either state or local campaigns in over 50 areas, has linked up, and this was just, a couple months ago with the American Savings Education Council, which is a real heavyweight savings organization based in Washington, D.C. You know, it includes all the federal agencies and a large number of nonprofits and even business groups that participate, with more of a focus on long-term savings, retirement savings, and savings at work. Whereas in America Saves, we have focused most of our attention on low and moderate income savers, which means that of necessity, our focus is mainly going to be on debt reduction on short-term savings, though we also emphasize medium and long-term savings as well. Finally, a role some of you work in congressional offices. America Saves Week would be a lot more effective if next year dozens, in fact hundreds of congressional offices were to support and promote the week back home. And there are many ways to do that. In fact, we have some evidence that a couple of offices are actually organizing savings efforts in their district. But if you're interested in participating, we have a year to plan now. Please contact us, and we'd be very happy to work with you to provide free materials and technical support and other support in order to help you build a savings movement back in your district. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. So we just heard Steve talk about Americans' lack of financial security as well as stability as a result of insufficient savings. And as he accurately points out, this is particularly prevalent among lower-income households who have less income to save and who will be disproportionately affected as a result of that. Research, on the other hand, shows that lower-income households are attempting to save, particularly for shorter-term needs, and they're more likely to do so when there's a product that's available to enable it. In a recent survey of over 1,000 lower-income households in Detroit, a little over 30% of them said that they were saving at least every month, with precautionary purposes being their major reason why. Over 70% reported saving in order to feel financially secure, as well as to help meet emergency and medical expenses. 51% said they were doing so in anticipation of events like a job loss. Interestingly, of the savers in the Detroit survey, 80% of them actually had a bank account that they were utilizing. And this information correlates with nationwide data of a survey that was conducted a few years back by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which found that 94% of households who were holding savings were doing so in an account. The OCC data also suggested that those with bank accounts were more likely to save. 78%, in fact, of those households who had bank accounts also had some savings. So with that backdrop in mind, I'm going to talk about two policy initiatives this morning to promote short-term flexible savings: the Assets and Transaction Account and the Auto Save Initiative. I'm then going to go into a discussion to transition our conversation to middle-term savings goals. And Carol Layden will then expand on that in her remarks following. And I just realized I had a PowerPoint here that I'm going to use as well. So before I dive into the proposals, I want to point out that 3 of these really suggest leveraging tax time in order to facilitate savings. And there are 3 major reasons why. The first being that tax time is an annual point in time when tax filers receive a significant lump sum payment, and for lower income households, it's often the largest payment they're going to get in that year. Refunds to lower income households range from $1,200 to $4,000, with an average amount of about $1,700. And all of the households with refunds due, and there are many, over half of them were to households with adjusted gross incomes of $30,000 or less. Second, many households are approaching tax time with particular savings goals and financial planning in mind. Research shows that many are using the filing process as a form of self-imposed savings by over-withholding throughout the year in order to receive a larger refund at tax time. And often these households have made plans well in advance of their refund for how they're going to use those monies, so incorporating some of that financial planning. And then third, tax time is a one-time a year when the federal government really interacts with households nationwide. This presents a unique opportunity, an annual opportunity for the federal government to connect with and promote savings at scale. So the first initiative or proposal I'd like to discuss with you is one to deliver a savings and transaction account at tax time and literally through the tax filing process. We've been working on this concept for a while now, and as I mentioned, we're calling it the Assets and Transaction Account, or ATA for short. As we've been thinking about it, the ATA would be delivered by financial institutions on behalf of the Treasury Department to tax filers who aren't already direct depositing into an existing account or who don't elect to receive a paper check. 5% of that refund, to build on what Steve suggests, 5% of that refund would be automatically deposited into an interest-bearing savings account, with the option for the tax filer on their tax reform to place more of their refund into that savings product. The monies in the savings account, they would be accessible, but again, building on what we know from behavioral economics, they might be a little bit harder to get a hold of. Instead of going up to an ATM and withdrawing the money, you might actually have to walk into a bank in order to make that withdrawal. The balance of the refund would be deposited into a transaction component of the account, of the ATA, where those monies could be accessed via a card, like you and I use our network-branded MasterCard credit cards. It's not a credit card. For ATM withdrawals, for point-of-sale purchases, and also the ability to make online bill payments and web purchases. The ATA would provide tax filers with an ongoing savings and transaction product. This could be loaded throughout the year, and the expectation is that people would have their wages and salary direct deposited into the account in order to make it an ongoing functioning product. And we think the combination of the explicit savings as well as the transaction would enable the tax filer to keep more of their refund as well as more of their income throughout the year, because they've got an alternative to the costly check cashers, payday lenders, and frankly bank accounts that are charging high overdraft fees. And then lastly, if we can get large-scale asset funding, which Carol is going to talk about, and I'm going to cover with the Savers bonus, this product could actually be the pipeline or the delivery channel for those monies to really reach millions of households across the country. So the second initiative I want to cover is something called AutoSave. And this idea builds on research showing that the workplace can be an effective venue for savings, particularly given the payroll systems that can make savings automatic and the acceptance that we all know as employees, and we know employers, feel with respect to the workplace being a credible and effective mechanism for savings. AutoSave, as we're thinking about it, would create a default payroll deduction in order to support flexible savings. Employees would be automatically enrolled into the savings plan, with a small portion of their wages being diverted into a non-tax advantage savings account. The accounts would earn interest and they would be accessible without penalties, but again, trying to build on what we know about the automatic savings. The theory goes that by utilizing defaults and building savings into the payroll system, our theory is that AutoSave will help to jumpstart the savings process by making it automatic, flexible, and inclusive. So over the next year at New America, we're going to be developing a demonstration to test out this theory, and we're hoping to engage between 4 to 6 employers to explore it. And among many questions that we would like to address with this, we want to get a sense of how defaulting workers into a savings account will affect their participation. Will they remain in the account or will they opt out? What will their participation levels be? An important question, how will their participation in such an automatic default into a savings, a flexible savings, affect any participation in longer-term retirement plans? So another tax time proposal that I want to mention is something that's garnered the interest and the support of Senator Menendez, and it's the Savers bonus. This is a proposal geared towards middle and longer-term savings objectives, and it would provide a savings incentive for earned income credit eligible tax filers. Provide a savings incentive for earned income credit tax filers. Under it, eligible tax filers who contribute to a savings product, including an IRA, a 529, a U.S. savings bond, would be eligible for a match through the tax filing process for those savings contributions. This builds on some of the research that we know from CFPB showing that incentives can and do matter in terms of encouraging savings. The match would be provided on a one-to-one basis, up to $500 each year, and could be progressively structured according to income. The proposal would also provide an account to tax filers who don't already have one. And then last, I want to mention a proposal to enable tax filers to purchase U.S. savings bonds with their tax refund via their tax return. This was actually something that was possible in the 1960s. Unfortunately, Treasury has taken it off the tax form, but there's work that's underway now by the nonprofit Doorways to Dreams that's actually finding that savings bonds hold a lot of appeal for lower income tax filers, particularly as a mechanism to save for their children and their grandchildren's education. This is the second year of D2D's demonstration, and they're finding that about 70% of bond purchasers had no savings investments prior to the purchase of the bond. In the new Savers Act, which was introduced last year by Senators Clinton and Gordon Smith, tax filers will have the option to purchase U.S. savings bonds when they file their tax returns. The bill will also fund a savings bond marketing campaign, as well as provide a credit to employers for encouraging their employees to purchase these bonds. And that's it for me. I'm going to turn it over to Carol, who will talk about middle-term savings goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa and Brian, New America Foundation Savings and Ownership Caucus, for the opportunity to talk about midlife asset goals. And if I could have everybody just sort of stand up for a minute. Stand up. And if people could hold their arm, one arm, right out in front of you, you can stretch it, just like that, parallel with the ground, keep it completely parallel, whoever can see me. Take your thumb and your index finger, put it together, make a circle, make sure your arms are parallel with the ground, and then I want you to touch your chin. Turn to the person next to you and tell them that your fingers are in the wrong place.
Oh.
The message, you can sit back down now,
Look at you.
is that actions speak louder than words. And that's the importance of today's message, that we want you to have an account. We can tell you to save, but if we don't make it available for you to save, it's going to be a lot harder. That's the importance of having an account. And that's why the government has incented different types of accounts for midterm savings. And those are specifically for 3 reasons: home ownership, college education, and small business. And it's done this in 2 different ways. One is universal accounts, and one is targeted towards low-income folks. So for the universal accounts, you have employer-sponsored retirement plans, like 401ks, 403bs, 457s, TSPs, for some of you in the room. And most folks think of these as retirement accounts, so 40 years down the road. But they actually have some flexibility, where you can reach into them and borrow money for home ownership or college education, and then pay that back 3 to 6 years, depending on your employer and the account management. So they're pretty fungible for home ownership and for education. Individual retirement accounts are actually even more fungible for those uses. You can put money into a Roth or regular IRA, and at some point in your life, you can take out up to $10,000 for a down payment assistance for a home, and then you don't have to pay that back. Also, you can take out whatever you need for college education in the year that you plan to attend college. For yourself or your child, you can use it for tuition, room and board, books, any college expense you're able to get out of an IRA without any penalty, without the 10% penalty you'd have to take otherwise for another, to use it to buy a boat, let's say, or take a vacation. So there's some fungibility in retirement accounts which really help people get to some of these midterm, midlife goals. There's also 5, and the difference between these, the IRA and 401k, these aren't always clear to people, and unfortunately there's a tax court case that determines exactly where that line is, and it's Lamar Jones versus IRS of 2005 case that really clarifies that you can only use IRAs for these fungible goals without having to repay it like you do with an employer-based plan. There's also 529 college savings accounts, which every state has, and these allow people's money that they save into a 529 to grow tax-free with a tax impact, and up to $125,000 a year you can put in. So it's pretty generous compared to a Roth IRA, which is about $5,000, or depending on your income. And then there's also Coverdell's, which are college savings accounts. Now, a number of states have provided incentives to encourage people to save into 529 accounts. They actually match the contributions of low-income families, encourage them to keep putting money in for college. Now, targeted to low-income people, we have programs. So we have more policies and products that are more universal, and for low-income folks, we have programs. And the largest of this is the Assets for Independence program at Health and Human Services. Provides about $24 million a year to help fund some of the individual development account programs around the country, managed savings accounts, or IDAs. There's 65,000 folks saving in IDAs, and they save for home ownership, college education for themselves or a child, or also for a small business startup. So this is where we really get the small business component involved. There's also legislation to try to bring IDAs to scale, and that's the Savings for Working Families Act, which has been introduced in the Senate by Mr. Lieberman and Mr. Bunning, and it's Senate Bill 871, and in the House, HR 1514 by Congresswoman Stephanie Tubbs Jones, Joe Pitts, and between the two of these bills, we have 108 co-sponsors. It's quite bipartisan and quite a lot of support, and it would expand IDAs from our current 65,000, which has funding through the Assets for Independence program, and a smaller program for the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which really targets refugees, and it's helped 19,000 folks actually do the purchase. And most importantly, with refugees, it helps them connect to the financial mainstream. Because if you can sort of see how complicated our financial system is for us, imagine if you just came to this country and you're trying to figure out just not only the money, but where to invest and where to save, and what's a good decision for you to make. Now, the Savings for Working Families Act is only one piece of legislation targeted towards midterm savings, and some of the other ones that Melissa talked about are also the savings, the savers bonus, and the savers bonus. We also are working with Family Self-Sufficiency Program at HUD, which is a program that connects case management with escrow savings to help people in public housing or Section 8 voucher holders actually develop a savings escrow account that they can use for midterm goals once they're ready to move out of public housing. And they've been off of any public assistance for a year. And there's 70,000 families participating in the Family Self-Sufficiency Program. And finally, children's savings accounts. CFED is working with 2,000 children across the country in 13 sites with matching accounts for kids, starting with Head Start kids in preschool all the way to foster care youth in high school and tribal high schools. So we're really seeing quite a lot of interest in how do you get folks at all levels and all ages to start connecting to accounts, learn to save, and then move into a wealth building or asset building goal. And some of the things that we found are, first of all, you have to provide access to accounts. That you have to help people open a bank account that they're able to save in a safe way, in a way that gets them a return. And secondly, you have to remove disincentives. And one of the great things about IDAs is any money that's in an Assets for Independence IDA is not included in the calculation of asset tests for public assistance. And this has been a really strong disincentive to save. If you have more than $2,000 in an IRA and you apply for food stamps, you're going to be disqualified until you spend that down. You have to pay your penalties, you have to pay any state or local taxes, federal taxes if necessary. So it's a real disincentive for low-income folks to kind of get into the savings mainstream. So luckily the House and the Senate have made this change in their versions of the Farm Bill of exempting IRAs, 529s, and covered L's from the asset limit test. And there might be a Farm Bill that actually makes this permanent. We're eager to. States have the option to also eliminate asset test public assistance, the temporary assistance to needy families program. And Rourke O'Brien from New America has really done some real research on the importance of doing that and the real low cost to states that most folks, almost everybody applying for TANF doesn't have $5,000 in an IRA. And then third, in addition to providing access, removing disincentives is to provide incentives. And that's where the ideas of matching really come to bear with the Savers Credit possibly being used for IRAs, and I know that Mark is going to talk more about that, the 529s with state matches. And the thing that Congress could do to encourage midterm savings is one, remove disincentives to save, two, provide access through new portals, and that's where the roles of nonprofits with IDAs, employers with employer-based accounts, VITA sites, and free tax prep sort of set up opportunities and access to accounts. And finally, the incentives. That many of us in the room, if we're saving in retirement accounts, we have incentives to save. The amount that we put into those accounts aren't taxed. We take the money out later, they might not be taxed if it's in a Roth, so all the incentives are really tax-based. And our research at CFED has shown that the government's already investing $367 billion a year in asset building. And the vast majority of that is going to households of over $80,000 a year. And for every dollar that we're spending on programs, encouraging low-income people to save and providing them access to accounts, we're spending $506 on the tax side. So our goal is to make savings, access more universal and more targeted to low-income people.
I'm Mark Avery, delighted to be here with you. Melissa, Ray, New America, Savings and Ownership Caucus. This is a terrifically exciting cluster of ideas, and if people are interested during our Q&A, I'm sure that all of us, as well as some of the very knowledgeable people who are sitting down here, can talk about how these things can fit together. They really can be made into a coherent overall strategy, and that's what we're all working toward. Let me start out my long-term section of it with two premises. First, picking up on what Carol just said, we've got hundreds of billions of dollars every year in the federal budget dedicated to promoting asset accumulation or saving in one way or another. Tax expenditures, well, we're not collecting any taxes in order to give a tax break to pensions, retirement savings, 401ks, IRAs, etc. In addition to the other programs Carol alluded to, account for over $100 billion a year. We're generating new deposits in the pension system these days, which are arguably more than that, but the net savings is arguably less. In other words, what we actually add to savings as opposed to just shift from one pocket, let's say a non-tax favored pocket, to another pocket, a tax favored pocket, is questionable in relation to the amount we're spending. So we need to make that expenditure more efficient. And one way to do that is to make it easier for people to save. Another way is to make it more remunerative for them to save without spending more money just at the top in the hope that it'll trickle down to the moderate and lower income people who most of us here today are most concerned about. Both Senator Obama and Senator Clinton have adopted this general framework, have taken the advice that we ought to, in the following way, make the saving both more remunerative for most Americans and easier for most Americans. The more remunerative starts from the proposition that if you give incentives to save to high-income people, they tend to shift from the one pocket to the other. Take your taxable mutual fund, shift some of it into a newly tax-favored account named after some member of Congress, typically. And if you give it to moderate and lower income people, they don't have all these financial assets, of course, sitting around already. There isn't much to shift. They don't have a lot of surplus income that they're already saving, that they'll just save in a new tax-favored thing. They'll actually tend to save more. So doing good and doing well happily coincide. If we target to moderate and lower income people, we actually increase national saving. The other proposition I would frame this with is that our tax incentives are deduction-based. That is, the value to us of saving $1 or having our employer save $1 for us is proportional to our tax bracket. You're in the 40% federal and state bracket, you save $1, you get 40 cents back in tax savings because of the deduction. So it costs you $1 minus 40 or 60 cents. You're in the tax bracket of most of the people we are focused on here, 15%, 10%, or 0% federal bracket. They get 15 cents, a dime, or 0 cents in tax savings when they save. Doesn't work well for the targeting we're looking for. Hence, the saver's credit. About a decade ago, when I was in the executive branch, we proposed this tax credit to add on to what we now have to encourage people to save in a way that'll make sense to the vast majority of Americans, not just the few who are in the top tax brackets, not just the small percentage in the top tax brackets. And that saver's credit gives you essentially 50 cents on the dollar, or unfortunately Congress cut it to 20 cents or 10 cents on the dollar, for saving you do in a 401k or an IRA, and could be expanded to other medium-term savings as well. So the credit is now in effect. 5.5 million people take advantage of it every year, but it was intended to be much broader. It was intended to be refundable. That is, if you have no tax liability, you get it anyway, you get a refund. So the amount we're rewarding for saving is not proportional to how high your tax bracket is. It's proportional to how much you save. Save $1, get 50 cents back. You can dial up and down the rate. The higher the rate, presumably the better, but it costs money. So that expanded saver's credit, that concept that we should give 100 million Americans access to that kind of credit for saving, whether they have a tax liability or not, that it should be 50 cents across the board and not cut to 10 or 20 cents. All of this being the original proposal from Treasury about a decade ago, enacted in a very truncated way. Obama and Clinton are both proposing to go back to that original, each of course putting their own name on it, which is fine. And the ideas, though, that we've been talking about here and that they have agreed to espouse are all in line. The other way to truly enhance this is to put it in the account. Not only make it a refundable tax credit so you get a check from IRS, but put the check in the account automatically so that becomes part of the saving. How to make it easier? Again, about a decade ago, I was losing sleep over whether to allow and how to define a notion that an employee could be put into a 401k plan without affirmatively electing, without signing anything. We decided that that was actually a great idea. The hesitation was whether it would reduce the employer matching contributions, because telling an employee you're in the plan unless you opt out, which we named automatic enrollment, would be a way to pass non-discrimination tests for employers. You, again, do well by doing good. Another win-win. You get the low-income people who don't save, and a lot of minorities who don't save, into the plan, and you get a better score on non-discrimination tests, which means executives can save more on a pre-tax basis. That turned out, I sort of made the bet that that would not cause employers to cut their employer match. We didn't want them to stop contributing on their own and just make employees do it themselves completely. So we decided to define this, to not regulate it, other than say you've got to give employees notice beforehand and the ability to opt out anytime, before, during, etc. And we promoted the heck out of it, got nowhere with it for a couple of years. The market didn't take much of an interest because they said, oh, these are just going to be small accounts for poor people, you know, not profitable. We said, well, that's the point. We think the lower income people can and should save. We've got to start somewhere. Ultimately, financial services will benefit with billions of assets under management, and you've got to do it. It was very lonely for several years having that argument. But it has become, eventually, it became apple pie. And now almost half the 401k market is doing automatic enrollment, and we are now all talking about things like extending it to shorter term or medium term savings. You call that auto-save, extending it to people who don't have access to an employer plan, which my co-author David John from the Heritage Foundation and I have called automatic IRA. So what we would do is make it easy for the 78 million folks who don't have an employer plan to save in long-term ways, IRAs, by having their employers put them into automatic enrollment, if you will. The employer doesn't have to contribute anything. The employee is connected to an IRA. And that all jives very nicely with the things we've been talking about in the short and medium-term saving areas. The concept of this automatic IRA has been likewise accepted and put in the platforms of both the Democratic candidates. It looks like it has traction in terms of bipartisan sponsorship here on the Hill and a lot of support. Various places, New York Times editorials said it's the best savings idea around. The GAO's given it a lot of play in their recent report on 401ks. Conservatives and liberals and progressives have adopted this idea with enthusiasm, etc. The automatic IRA is essentially an extension of automatic enrollment in 401ks, which, as I think, Melissa, you mentioned the academic research has corroborated. That's nice. We didn't really need it because we got it working first, saw that it was working, and then terrific academic research from Bridget Majory and David Lakeson and others illustrated how it worked in a particular several companies and gave a number of insights that led to improvements. The improvements are what Jack Dwarnicki is going to talk about. Melissa and I thought it would be terrific to punctuate this and drive it home with an illustration of a great automatic enrollment program in a 401k plan in an actual company. Nationwide has done what I call second generation automatic 401k. You don't just enroll people at a low level and keep them there. The academic research shows that people tend to stick at that level. You don't want them to stick at 3% of pay. It's not enough. So what Jack's been doing at Nationwide with his colleagues is what we've been encouraging the nation to do. Start higher or escalate people automatically to higher levels of contribution. Enroll automatically not just new hires, but existing employees, people who have been in the company but haven't been in the plan. for some years, and put people in investments that make sense for the workforce that you have as a default. Let them opt out to whatever they want, but if they're not sure, put them in something that is reasonable. For 401k populations, often they're a little more affluent than a lot of the people we're most worried about, so maybe an asset allocated fund with some diversified equities and some more principal preservation funds makes sense. But each employer can decide, and the Labor Department has given good impetus to this. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jack for really what is a very inspiring illustration of how a second generation automatic enrollment can work.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for the opportunity to present. Important to point out that all companies in America today, regardless of size, pretty much do what we're doing. There's obviously companies that support large, small, medium, as well as jumbo firms like Nationwide. I've been with Nationwide about 22 years, always in the employee benefits function. And today we'll talk about auto enrollment at Nationwide with respect to Nationwide employees. This is not necessarily Nationwide as a record keeper for other employers. This is Nationwide for its own employees. And while we measured the changes of auto enrollment, auto increase, many different ways, we're only going to talk about two for time purposes, participation as well as retirement preparation. What's a little bit different about our story is we actually have been providing employees a statement annually for the last 11 or 12 years that shows whether they're on track, whether they're on the way to prepare for retirement, maintaining their pre-retirement standard of living. And so we took this opportunity to measure preparedness both before and after auto enrollment. And that'll be a part of this presentation as well. All right, so go to the next slide. This is the, for those benefits people that want the numbers, they want it one slide. Here it is. I have a boss who wants one slide, so there it is. Okay, bottom line, we had about 77% participation before the change, pretty typical. We had about 54% of our employees, as best as we could tell, looking only at their benefit plan participation in Social Security, who were on track, who would be able, if they continued to do what they would do, be able to maintain their pre-retirement standard of living if they continued with Nationwide until age 65. An average deferral percentage of about 6%. We were passing our discrimination tests. This wasn't part of that at all. So we added automatic features in April of 2007 and parentally thereafter. In fact, we just kicked off our annual enrollment effort, auto enrollment effort for 2008, just this week. We enroll everybody at 3% if you're not already at 3%, at least 3%. Give you the opportunity, obviously, to opt out. And then increase anyone 1% if you're between 3 and 5%. That's where we've started. That won't be where we end, but that's where we are today, and we're in the process now of just making it almost a natural thing at Nationwide. The results, 95% of our employees are participating. 64% are on track for retirement. There's a little story in there. That's more than what we predicted we would get if everybody just accepted the automatic enrollment that we were offering. It's higher than what we thought we were going to get. Average deferral percentage of about 7%, just short of 7%. With the match, which didn't change, that puts on average people at about 10%, which is a little bit higher than what other companies are achieving. Vanguard reports, for example, that the majority of their folks with automatic enrollment are averaging less than 9%, if I remember correctly. And, you know, there's a price to pay, increased match as well. So the bottom line is that it worked out pretty well for all associates. Flip to the next slide. Again, this is perennial. It's all about reframing the participation question. You know, how you set your defaults and everything else is really important. Basically, it requires people to take an action if they don't want to participate. And that's why auto enrollment seems to work pretty well. You get pretty high levels of participation. You have to be careful about where you start, folks, and that you increase them. Again, ours is a little bit different because we went after not only new hires, but also current employees. Again, Vanguard looked at automatic enrollment, and they identified the fact that most employers are only aimed at new hires. But we decided we wanted to go after current employees as well. One thing we concluded that if we were, again, if we got everybody to do auto enrollment, we'd end up increasing the group prepared for retirement from about 54 to about 58%. But we actually did a little better than that. Sorry, the slide's a little small. There is a smaller, even smaller print one in the handout material as well. Bottom line, again, 95%, 64% on track, and then I went ahead and did it by age group. What we found was really interesting is that time is still, with respect to retirement preparation, perhaps your most important asset. Yes, you do have to act. Yes, you should reconsider what you're contributing. But what we did is we really improved the preparedness percentage, the percentage of employees on track for retirement who are under the age of 45. Now, obviously, we can only see what we can see from their benefit plans. So for all we know, people who are over 45, people who, many of them worked in other companies before they came to Nationwide, had assets somewhere else. So they may be also on track, just that we can't see it from our benefit plans. What's interesting is that we exceeded our goals, not so much because people didn't respond or there was inertia. We actually affected over 15,000 employees. And we communicated so frequently. We had one person who just ignored everything we did. That person was the winner. He got 17 different messages from different media. But all that said and done, we got just eight appeals when it was all said and done. Good. And then I went ahead and showed for full plan years participation comparing 2007 versus 2006. What's interesting here is on the low income side of the second part of the chart, people earning less than $30,000 a year, our average participation there was somewhere between 85 and 86% of all employees in that cohort who are participating. Vanguard predicts in its study of automatic features that if you just rely on voluntary enrollment, you'll get typically somewhere in the 30 to 40% range in terms of people coming into the firm and actually enrolling in the 401k. All right, and I want to thank also those of you who had a hand in the Pension Protection Act and made it possible, made it clear that we really could do automatic enrollment. I want to flip to the next other, you're already up there. This is just a little sampling about all the different reports that are out there. If you Google any of these links or this set of information, you'll find studies. They're all out there online. But what's really interesting is, again, I'll go back to the Vanguard. It said that in the employers that they surveyed in their group, that about 12% of them have been doing auto enroll. And what we're seeing from all the other record keepers is that number is really growing and growing quickly. Some are reporting 30 and 40% adoption rates for employers in terms of selecting automatic enrollment. All right, and then a couple of low-cost, very low-cost initiatives, at least I'd say. One of the things that I think is now coming to the fore, Nationwide has been privileged to be part of this with Dr. Linnell, with respect to the Center for Retirement Research, is we're starting to tease out the entire retirement preparation story, including retirement health care. And so one of the concepts that was formerly in Portland Garden a couple of years ago, one that didn't make it to become law, was the concept of a retiree medical savings account that you would put alongside the 401k. I want to say that that's employer money, and so again, it would be up to employers if they wanted to voluntarily adopt that. On the employee side, again, thank you for those of you who had a hand in the Tax Relief and Healthcare Act of December 2006, because you gave more flexibility to people who would save using a health savings account for not necessarily just short-term, but intermediate and long-term health care expenses. The other thing I wanted to point out about some of these are that Roth, with it becoming permanent as part of the Pension Protection Act, There's a lot of different ways that we could leverage the Roth opportunity that's out there today. It may have a more modest impact in terms of its budget impact in the current period as well, because